In the early 1940s, just before the jet age and what most consider to be the golden age of flying, well, it wasn't as easy and enjoyable as it would lead you to believe. Flights took a lot longer than they do today, almost double, and the airliners of the day couldn't fly high enough to avoid any bad weather, so the flight was usually pretty uncomfortable, and there was often multiple stops for fuel during one trip. Luckily for them, a new age was just around the corner. In the late 1940s, Britain had a major problem. Despite the war having just finished a few years prior, the world had more or less gone back to normal, and out of it the rise of air travel had become a new market, and America had the market pretty much cornered. At one point in time, almost 90% of all air passengers were flying on these, the all-American built McDonnell Douglas DC-3s. You see, during the war, America had focused most of their attention on building military transportation aircraft to get their boys over to Europe, meaning that after the war they could just swap the cargo bays for seats and hit the ground running in the commercial market. However, for Britain it wasn't as simple. During the war for them, most of their focus was on building heavy bombers to help in throwing the Blitz back to Germany. The UK government therefore decided that to get back into the race they would have to build something completely brand new from the ground up, and a jet-powered airliner seemed like the way to go. However, others were sceptical. Thought at the time being that jet engines produced too little power relative to the amount of fuel consumed. Despite these potential issues, though, they pushed on, and eventually the aircraft company of de Havilland was chosen to be the producer of the world's first jet-powered aircraft. Along the way, multiple fake designs were created, meant to confuse fellow aircraft corporations into questioning what the British were up to, which is why when the aircraft was publicly released just a few years later, in 1949, the world stood still. The stats were pretty impressive, and the swept wings and ghost engine design was beyond futuristic compared to the piston airliners of the day. Even when looking at it at present times, it still looks like a relatively new design, and back then they had no problems filling orders. Even in the West, airlines were looking to buy, and Pan American Airlines placed an order to have a modified version of the Comet. For the Comet to work and be a fuel-efficient replacement for conventional propeller airliners, it was discovered that flying high was the way to go, and as such it flew at an unmatched 40,000 feet, over 20,000 feet more than anything before it. This, however, meant that the cabin would have to be pressurized so the passengers could breathe normally, and along with it came multiple problems related to the hydraulic and electrical systems, these being a result of such a new, clean and unproven design. However, just a few short years later, a BOAC Comet would fail to take off when leaving Rome, and just a year later another would have a similar accident in Pakistan, although this time being a Canadian Comet. It was later found out through the Air Investigation Branch that a redesign of the Comet's leading edge of the wings was needed, yet people still held their expectations high for the Comet. But just a month later another Comet would be involved in an incident, and this time with far worse outcome than both previous. A comet leaving Kolkata would disintegrate flying through bad weather, and then just a few months later another one after leaving Rome, this one being put down to explosion. After this reached the headquarters of BOAC, the airline that had the most comets in its fleet, they decided to ground the entire fleet while an investigation went forward into the cause of the accidents. It was decided that the accidents were potentially caused by turbine explosions in the engine casing, and so it was made stronger to be able to withstand should it happen again. Once it re-entered service a while later, BOAC had no issues trying to get people on the jet, and it seemed to be a quick dodge for the company. However, it wouldn't last long, and a few months later another exploded while travelling over the Mediterranean. Now the whole worldwide fleet of comets was forced to be grounded, as a result of the FAA revoking their certificate of airworthiness. Meanwhile, the Air Accident Investigation Branch would start with a huge-scale look into the accident, and it was eventually revealed that a sudden loss of pressure was to blame for the disintegration of the airframe. The main focus leading to the windows, specifically the square design being a large reason for the creation of small cracks that through each pressurization cycle would expand and eventually break apart. This time, the worldwide fleet of comets would be grounded for years, while the investigation reached its end. And while all this was happening, the rest of the world was catching up, with foreign markets now releasing their own jet airliners, until all of a sudden the Americans released theirs, and instantly the tide shifted, once again. In 1958, Boeing released the 707, and not long after, McDonnell Douglas the DC-8. Meanwhile, de Havilland would try and release the Comet Type 4, with a longer fuselage and rounded windows, But it never stood up to the American offerings, and only 76 were delivered to airlines, compared to over 500 DC-8s and 1,000 707s. The later versions of the Comets would continue to fly into the late 60s and 70s, with the final commercial flight being in the 80s, but some remained flying up until 1997, where the final one was retired. However, there's no going back on the idea that the British and the Comets brought the world into what is now the jet age. However, unbeknownst to them, another turn was just around the corner.